Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 95. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Andalusia in southern Spain.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. 15-hour flight, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. The first news story I have for you today is some bad news about frequent flyer miles. As we've talked about previously on this show, the airlines have a large number of unclaimed frequent flyer miles, and it's increasingly more difficult to use those miles. Well, they are changing their programs, and they're changing them not for the better. I'll put a link in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com to an article called Frequent Flyer Rules Changes Rarely Benefit Travelers that comes from smartertravels.com. One of the pieces of information that comes from this article is, after years of relative stability, Delta cut the period of time during which member accounts must be active from the industry standard 3 years to 2. U.S. Airways amended its policy effective January 31st of this year, reducing its expiration policy from 3 years to 18 months. United announced in January that beginning next year, Mileage Plus members also have to be active within the 18 months to keep their miles alive. Making a bad situation worse, these rules changes were designed to apply retroactively. So when United's new policy takes effect on January 1st, 2008, miles and accounts with no activity since January 1st, 2006 will be deleted. What spurred me to look for this article was a rule change in American Airlines, which is where I keep most of my frequent flyer miles, and they have also implemented a similar change. Effective December 15th, 2007, mileage balances will expire from American Advantage accounts that have not had miles either earned or redeemed within the previous 18-month period. So if you have not used your frequent flyer miles, you might make sure that you understand the policy for your particular program, and you might want to book some tickets possibly far in advance to make sure that your miles don't expire. For those of you who are recent subscribers to the show, you may not be aware that there's also a video version of The Amateur Traveler. It is not the same show. It is about a 5-minute show that is featuring movies that I've taken on various trips, and so the latest one went up this week, and it's about the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. There will be, I hope, several more coming before my trip this summer to Europe, as I'm trying to catch up on some of the video that I've taken over the last year before I take more video in Europe. And then, speaking of multiple versions of the show, this seems like a good time to reiterate something I've said numerous times in previous shows. There are 2 versions of the show you are listening to. One is the iTunes Enhanced version, which includes pictures and links and needs to be played either in iTunes on Windows or Mac or on an iPod with a screen, like a video iPod. Then there's also an MP3 version of the show. Those of you who listen to the MP3 version of the show may be a little sick of an advertising campaign that the Podshow Network, of which this podcast is a part, has been advertising. And so you might be a little surprised when I say that most of the people who listen to the show have not, at least on this show, heard about that campaign. So my apologies here for a second. The vast majority of the listeners of this show subscribe to the iTunes Enhanced version, and that version, here's a little secret for you, doesn't get ads right now, not at least pre-ads and post-ads on the show. And so for those of you who listen to the MP3 version of the show, that's something you might be interested in, and you can get the other version of the show certainly through iTunes, and there are instructions on the website, amateurtraveler.com, how to do that. For those of you who listen to the iTunes version of the show, what you have missed is that Podshow is having a contest, and if you go to suckless.podshow.com, and there'll be links to that in the show notes, you can give your opinions about the Podshow Network and how they can improve it, and in so doing you will enter in a contest to win valuable prizes. Those of you who are longtime listeners to the show may know that this show about Andalusia in southern Spain has been a long time in coming. I've made numerous references over the last couple of years to this particular trip, a trip taken a few years back to Spain. And this particular trip, we went to Madrid and Toledo and Sevilla and Granada and Cordoba and Los Pueblos Blancos, the white towns of Andalusia, to Malaga, to Segovia, to Barcelona, and to Villa. That was, as it turns out, way too many places to go to on one trip, which was only about a 2-week trip, and it will also be way too much information to talk about for one show. And so I'm just going to focus this show on southern Spain. Before I get into this, I should note that I'm going to try, where possible, to use the Spanish and the English pronunciation for places that I name, but I should warn you that my Spanish pronunciation is largely influenced by Mexican Spanish, being as I live in California and have been to Mexico 10 times and Spain only once, and so I will tend to say, for instance, plaza instead of the Spanish version plaza, or cinco instead of cinco if I try and pronounce something in Spanish. So let's start with some of the basics about southern Spain. When to go. Don't go in summer. Unless you're a particular fan of the heat, don't go in summer. Andalusia is quite warm and can easily get to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit or over 40 degrees centigrade. And so if you're not a big fan of the heat, don't go in summer. And having said that, of course, this trip that I'm talking about, we went in the summer. And the majority of tourists do go in the summer, and especially if they're going to the beach areas in southern Spain, like Malaga, that might in fact be appropriate. But I'm really going to focus not so much on the beach culture there, which is really less like Spain than some of the rest of Andalusia. It really is much more of a tourist-based culture. And we're going to focus instead on more of the classical Spanish portions of Andalusia. Flying into Spain, you're probably flying in either to Madrid or to Malaga, which actually gets quite a lot of traffic, especially as we said, in the summer tourist traffic. And so this particular trip, we actually flew into Madrid, and we started going into the Andalusian region by taking the high-speed train, which is a wonderful option, from Madrid down to Sevilla, or Seville as it's often known in English. So let's start with Sevilla, both the historic and the current capital of Andalusia. Sevilla is an interesting city because the ships that sailed for the New World came in and out of Sevilla, and so both its influence on Latin America is fairly strong in the sense that the Spanish spoken in Mexico and the rest of Latin America is supposed to be closer to Sevilla than any other place in Spain. If you want to get an impression for the amount of riches that were brought back from the New World into Sevilla and then into the rest of Spain, check out the cathedral in Sevilla, and especially behind the altar, the rich gold encrusted facade, and you get an impression for just the kind of wealth that was flowing in through this city. The cathedral, like so many in Spain, is built on top of a mosque. The history of Spain is heavily impressioned by the fact that the Moors ruled much of Spain, especially southern Spain. Andalusia was the last portion where they ruled for about 500 years, give or take, depending on which area you're talking about. And especially that presence is felt in Andalusia. And next to cathedral is La Giralda, and La Giralda is originally the minaret from this mosque that was built on this spot, and now is the bell tower for the cathedral. And I would recommend you go up into the bell tower, into La Giralda, which has a wonderful view of the city. One of the interesting things about this bell tower is that when it was used as a minaret, the person who would go up to call out the prayers would actually ride their horse up most of the bell tower. And so the bell tower has a spiral, not staircase, but a spiral ramp so that you can ride a horse up it. So it's a nice hike up to the top and a wonderful view of the city, especially the plaza around the cathedral, and also the next door to the cathedral is the Alcázar, or the Royal Palace. And this was built not so much by the Moors, but in the Moorish style, just after the reconquest of Sevilla in the 1300s. And this type of architecture is called the mudéjar style of architecture. One of the things you'll notice is you won't find any images. You'll find instead geometric patterns. And these patterns are often accomplished either with ceramic mosaics or with ornate woodwork. And so a logical next stop is to go next door to the Alcázar and to tour both that palace and the ornate gardens, which are also part of that. The fountains, which are also used quite a lot in Moorish architecture, can be seen in that design also. Both the cathedral and the Alcázar are located in a region of Sevilla, the oldest region, called Santa Cruz, or Santa Cruz. And this is also the region where flamenco comes from. And so while you're here, if you're a fan of flamenco music, you might find yourself a local venue to listen to or watch a flamenco performance. Movie lovers may want to get out to the Parque Maria Luisa, specifically to the Plaza de España, and you might recognize this building as being used in Episode 1 and Episode 2 of Star Wars, as Queen Amidala's royal palace. We did also do a tour of the bull rink in Sevilla. We did not take in a bullfight, being a little squeamish. I mentioned that Sevilla was a port, or at least used to be used as a major port, and both the bullfight rink, Plaza de Toros, as well as the imposing Moorish tower from the 13th century's Torre de Oro, are down by the river. As you get out from Sevilla, one place that is nearby that I think is a must-stop, especially for history lovers like myself, is Italica. Italica is the Roman ruins of the first city in Spain founded by the Romans, and also that became a major city. Two emperors coming from Italica, both the Emperor Trajan and the Emperor Hadrian, came from Italica. And in Italica, you can see some of the floor mosaics that were left over at the various houses, as well as a Roman theater there. It won't take you too long to see Italica. There are also some of the artifacts that have been found there are in an archaeological museum in Sevilla. And then after we leave Italica, we're going to head towards Los Pueblos Blancos. And Los Pueblos Blancos, the white towns of Andalusia, are these towns that were built up on the hill for protection, because this is the last portion of Spain to be reconquered from the Moors. And so The first town you're going to go to, for instance, is Arcos de la Frontera. And de la Frontera, of the frontier, basically Arcos was on the border for many years between Christian Spain and Moorish Spain. And so these towns are built up on these hills, and they're white stucco because they're very warm, as I mentioned, in the summer. And so what you'll find in these little towns, and Arcos is a really good example of them, are these very narrow streets so that the sun, it doesn't shine on it so much, in these whitewashed towns. They're really quite beautiful, fun to just go up, park your car and walk around. Also, if you are using Rick Steves' guidebook, and the two guidebooks we used for our particular trip were both the DK Spain, Travel Guide for Spain, as well as the Rick Steves' guidebook. And the Rick Steves' guidebook had a really interesting tidbit about Arcos. One of the things that you'll find there is a nunnery, and the nunnery there is a cloistered nunnery. But the nuns still make money selling cookies. And so we took Rick's advice and we went to the nunnery there, and you can buy your cookies from the nuns, but you can't see them because they are cloistered, and so they don't interact with people. And so what you do is I think you ring the bell, as I recall, and then you put your money basically on a little lazy Susan that turns around and comes back with your nun cookies. The cookies were good, and the experience was kind of interesting. It's very odd going to a store, as it were, where you don't actually see the people that you're buying from. So you might want to check that out. Rick also points out that you can ask the person in the bell tower who lives in a little apartment in the bell tower in the church in Arcos if you can walk through his apartments and up into the bell tower, but we're too shy for that. Arcos, like the rest of these towns here in Los Pueblos Blancos, has a wonderful view because it is up on this protective hill. And so just a beautiful little city to walk around in. So that's one of the two towns that I'm going to recommend you stop in. The second one is going to be Ronda. And before we get to Ronda, we're going to make another stop. And the stop we're going to make at is a cave. And the cave we're looking for is Cueva de la Paleta. And this is a cave that was found by some farmers, and still the descendants of this farmer allow access to this cave. And it is near one of the small towns, very close to the city of Ronda. And those of you who've been listening to the show for a very long time may remember me talking about driving in Spain and actually missing the road that I was on. And this is what happened on the way to this particular cave. So there is a point at which you're traveling south along these little tiny roads through these little tiny towns, not meant for automobile traffic. Remember how I said the streets were very, very narrow. And the street actually took not a left turn, but a left and back turn. So it made a turn that was a very acute angle, and I missed that the road had turned that way. And so I went straight, and we're driving down this little tiny street, and the road got narrower and narrower and narrower, and pretty soon there's a little lady walking in front of me, and there's actually no physical room for me to pass her until she steps up on her front porch step. It becomes so narrow, and I turn a corner at some point, and I'm stuck. And we basically weren't sure we were ever going to get the car out of there. We had to back up and go forward inches at a time until I could turn the car enough to make this angle and get back to the road that I was supposed to be on. I'd like to say that this is an isolated incident, but again, these towns, while I think it's a really great idea to have a car and go on this particular route, as long as you follow the roads, you'll be fine. But when you get down to the town itself, it's best to park and walk because they're not made for automobiles. We met someone in Ronda who expressed a similar story where they were driving down a road and suddenly it became a Sadwak cafe. And so the only way forward would have been through all the tables. And so instead, one of the locals volunteered and got in the car and managed in a very tight space to turn the car around and wouldn't accept payment, but just bid these tourists on their way. So that's a little bit about driving in Spain. More stories about that in the Driving in Europe episode from well early on in the show. So anyway, this particular cave has Neolithic cave art. So it has pictures that were drawn by what we would call cavemen, and the people who are running the tours are this farmer. So you show up at this little tiny parking lot or a little tiny place to park, walk up the hill, and there is a cave with some bars over it. And if you, like us, are the first people there, or the first people there since the last group went in, you wait, and eventually other people show up and you hang out and talk to them. A number of different tourists who were there. And again, we learned about this cave through the Rick Steves guidebook. And then eventually the farmer shows up or opens up the gate and lets out the previous group. And you aren't allowed to take pictures, unfortunately, in this cave, but it is a really wonderful experience. As you walk into this cave and go down, you'll see at various places in this cave both simple calendars that people kept as well as more traditional cave art. And so this was a place where people lived for some time, a very long time ago. And it was a wonderful stop, and also in the very warm weather of Andalusia, it was very cool in more ways than one. I should mention two places that are nearby that I have skipped on this trip because we did skip them for time reasons. And they are both Jerez de la Frontera, which is known for both the home of sherry as well as Andalusian horses. And so that might be something that if you're an equestrian fan, you will want to check out, or a sherry fan. That is near the city of Cadiz, which is the oldest continuously inhabited city in Western Europe. And then the other place that we did skip, which is directly south of Los Pueblos Blancos, is Gibraltar. And so if you're interested in getting a spot of tea, that might be a stop that you would want to make. And so our next stop is Ronda. And Ronda is both the home of bullfighting as well as one of the most spectacular cities here in the White Towns of Andalusia visually. And Ronda is built literally on cliffs, and one of the places that I'm going to recommend you stay in Ronda is in the Parador. And the Paradors are a series of hotels that are run by the country of Spain, typically in historically significant buildings, although not always. And the specific Parador in Ronda is in the old city hall, and it is literally at the top of these cliffs. And so as you are looking out from your hotel room, you are looking down onto the gorge that surrounds Ronda. And Ronda is built in two different portions. There are two different portions of the town with bridges going in between the two, and it's just a spectacular place to visit in terms of just a picture-perfect spot. From there, my family headed down to the beach and went down to Malaga for a brief outing at the beach. Just a couple things for you to know if you're going down there. One is it's a lovely beach in terms of getting in the water when it is that warm. And then for Americans, just be aware that obviously the Europeans are a little more casual in their beach attire. And that may sound attractive to you or it may not, but I'd like to put this mental image in your mind. This is something that I was quoted as saying when we were at the beach there. Oh, look, Grandma's got a new bikini. I certainly wish she'd wear all of it. So it isn't always necessarily the mental picture that you would be prepared for. And after that, we headed up to Granada. And Granada is the last of the Moorish cities that fell during the reconquest of Spain. And one of the most spectacular things that you will find in Granada is the Alhambra. And I would definitely recommend the Alhambra. Even if you skip the Alcazars and all the other cities in Andalusia, go to the Alhambra, get there early, get a ticket, find out what time you need to get there. You do need a reservation for it, and it does get a fair number of tourists. There are two different parts to the Alhambra itself and the Generalife, and I would recommend going to both of them. And I want to pause at this point and tell you one of our favorite stories from our trip to Spain that we retell often. Before I do that, I need to set up the story. So let me tell you a little more about this trip. I mentioned that we went in the heat of the summer. Now, my wife and my son especially don't deal with heat very well, and this really was quite warm. We went out in Cordoba one day, and I was wearing the day pack that had our stuff in it, and when I got back that day, I took off the day pack, and not only was my shirt soaked, but there was just a line of salt where I was losing minerals from sweating so much in this heat. And the way that you deal with this is you make sure that you stay in the cities for an appropriate period of time so that you can take the siesta whenever else does and not go out in the heat of the day. But we hadn't done that on this trip. We have since enforced a new rule of a 2-night minimum in the cities that we go to, and that's in fact the rule that we'll be using on our trip to Europe in July. But we hadn't done that, and this is how we learned this the hard way. So we're out in the heat of the day when no one else is. So first of all, that's grueling, and then because that's grueling, we're hungry sooner for dinner and wanting to go to bed sooner. Well, the Andalusian culture, the Spanish culture, is much more of a take the siesta in the middle of the day. The store is often closed from 1 to 5, somewhere in that time range. And then if you're ready to eat at 6 or 7 o'clock, like we were, to the restaurant where the locals would eat, haven't opened up yet. They won't open up till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. That's when their people are going to be eating. And so what we often would do is we'd find ourselves walking into a tourist restaurant, a restaurant that is open just to cater to tourists. And quite often you would walk in and you would know that you were going to get a bad meal right from the start. You walk in and immediately you're aware that this is a bad restaurant. It's just your only choice. And so we did a lot of things wrong on this trip, and it was fairly grueling. I thought my kids would never travel with me again. And so in the midst of this trip here, we get to Granada, and we'd been traveling a number of days. We really did this part that I'm describing to you, which is probably a 2-week trip, in about 5 days. So we did 2 nights in Sevilla, 1 night in Ronda, 1 night in Granada, 1 night in Cordoba, which we'll get to. And that's way too fast. And so we're tired. We're probably a little punchy. It's quite warm. One of the things that stands out with the Alhambra and with Granada, which really did rise above this level of weariness from travel, is the beautifulness of the architecture, but also the use of the gardens and the use of the water and the use of, it's just a very beautiful place, and you can see how that particular architectural style, especially the fountains and such, really was important in this Moorish architecture. This is a Moorish palace originally, although if you look around, you can see places where Ferdinand and Isabel, you can see the F and the Y from their initials, where they have done further changes to the palace after they had conquered Granada, because they would be the most Catholic monarchs who finished the Reconquest, and then, by the way, in the same year, sent this guy named Christopher Columbus off to the New World. We get to the Alhambra, and one of the things we got was the audio guide. And we recommend getting the audio guide, but one thing I would tell you is, to our tastes, and again, this is a personal thing, the audio guide for the Alhambra was rather melodramatic. And it quoted a lot from Washington Irving's poem, The Alhambra, which is one of the things that led to the preservation of this structure and of this portion of Granada. When he had gone there, it was largely in ruins and largely not appreciated, and he had written this wonderful poem, The Alhambra, and brought attention to this place, and it had been since restored and kept up and such. So he's very important to the story of the Alhambra. And we're listening to this guide, and it's things like, to hear the bell of the villa, I would, and then the person would describe all these terrible things that they'd be willing to do to hear the bell of the villa. Well, we were a little punchy by this time, and so it got, as we were retelling the story, it got worse and worse. My son is listening to the guide, and he's giving us the version, to hear the bell of the villa, I would walk across hot coals, to hear the bell of the villa. And I have this picture of my wife just cracking up listening to this audio guide, and I'm sure it's because we were so punchy, but it's the proof that I have that really we did have a good time on this trip, despite how difficult it had been at times. And also, I think in Granada, a couple things that we remember is, and you're in the Arab part of the city, or the Moorish part of the city, in the old town below Granada, the lovely little twisted streets, the little tiny buses there because they can't fit the full-size buses. And we did find a good restaurant that night. I was able to have a very good gazpacho, and if you haven't appreciated the benefits of cold soup, then you haven't been in really hot weather. And a good gazpacho is spicy and tangy, but actually a cold soup. And we only have one more stop on our whirlwind tour of Andalusia here, and that's the city of Cordoba. And the main reason we're going to Cordoba is for one particular building, and that's La Mezquita. And it's interesting, as I think back on this trip, how much for me it builds. I enjoyed Sevilla. I loved the Pueblos Blancos. Ronda was spectacular. Granada was amazing. And then in this whole area, La Mezquita might have been my favorite building that we saw architecturally. It is a former mosque, obviously, and La Mezquita literally comes from mosque. And inside are this sea of pillars, and in a way it really represents a lot of the history of Spain, because these pillars were from previous churches or temples. They would be from Visigoth churches or Roman temples that were taken out, and they were all used in this sea of pillars inside this mosque. And they're different sizes, of course, and so some of them have a different size base than others do. And so if you look at them closely, you can see they don't really match, and yet they've been made to match in this architecture. And in between the pillars are these arches, these red and white arches that go in between them, and it's a very beautiful building inside. It's relatively dark and cool, as is appropriate in this sort of climate, and very peaceful also, I think. And in the midst of this now is a church sanctuary that was built under the orders of King Carlos, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabel. And apparently after he saw what had been done to this building, despite the fact that his faith was very important to him, he exclaimed, quote, "You have built what you or others might have built anywhere, but you have destroyed something unique in the world." So he regretted that they had done it, although it turns out that having done that, it both helped the stability of the building, apparently, as well as protected this structure during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. And so it may have perhaps have saved the La Mezquita in the process. And I think with that, we'll wrap up this trip to Andalusia. The only other thing I would say about Andalusia, it is still, as I understand, relatively inexpensive place to visit. And even places like the Parador and Ronda, and I put a link into the current prices of that in the show notes, really weren't all that expensive, considering that you're staying in a fairly significant building in a very dramatic location. I have just one internet resource for you today, and that's going to be freeineurope.com. Basically, freeineurope.com is, as the name implies, a place to find things that you can do in Europe that have no admission charge. So check that out. In the community news, I had 3 real quick things for you. One, I thought it was interesting that Michelle put a comment on last week's episode 94, the Greek islands, that she is headed off to Athens for a European Jugglers Convention, which is going on this summer. That's an unusual and interesting vacation, and caught my attention. The other 2 stories I have for you came from the discussion boards. We have a post, and I'll put links to both of these in the show notes, that is a review of a Carnival Conquest cruise out of Galveston going to the Caribbean, and talks about some of the good and bad experiences that can happen with some of the side trips or some of the excursions from cruise, and particularly a bad trip that happened at a bad excursion experience in Jamaica, where they went on a Carnival sponsored cruise experience, and it says, "We chose blindly the Dunn Falls and Dolphin Cave excursion. The trip out there was 2 hours with bad roads, traffic, and detours. The falls would have been beautiful if it wasn't packed with tourists. At the falls, you can actually get in at the bottom and climb to the top. This sounds exciting until you get there and find out that you have to stay in our group of about 50, hold hands with the person on either side, and are guaranteed that you will fall over about 10 times and bruise your shins at least 5 of those times. There were 300 people in the water, so crowded that we elected just to take the stairs on one side of the falls and not go in." So, and that it does point out one of the bad experiences that can happen with cruises, where you can really take over a destination, which is interesting then, because the other post that I'll also link to in the show notes came from another listener who, on a trip to Egypt recently, decided to avoid that sort of crowded scene by hiring a individual guide rather than taking a large organized tour. And they went with Ahmed, and Ahmed turned out to be not just a tour guide, but turned into more of a family friend. And so read some of those experiences in the discussion boards about that trip. And I would encourage people to go to the discussion boards and tell us a little more about your stories. If this particular week's show didn't prove to you that you probably know as much about travel as I do, then I'm not sure what will. So I really appreciate it when you share your travel experiences with the rest of the audience. And with that, we'll bring this show to a close. I'd love to hear from you also. Please send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or post to the discussion boards as we talked about, or check out many other ways to contact me at amateurtraveler.com/contact. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.